Erika Diaz, honestly, how mental are you?
How mental am I? I would say I'm pretty mental, I think, for a lot of different reasons. So very, very mental. What about you, Rob? How mental are you?
I'm up there with you. I'm definitely on the very mental side of things for sure.
Yeah.
Overthinker, over negative thinker, all the things.
Oh,
Erica,
yeah.
thank you for being here on Equal Matters today. This is a podcast designed around this concept of equal dialogue. Let's dig into issues, and Erica's podcast is called Honestly Mental, where Erica so bravely discusses the issue of mental health and how it's impacted her life. And I love it because it's such a rare way that I get to ask you the question how honestly mental you are, but I think it's so relatable as someone that has experience in my own mental health journey. So I just think that's fascinating. You're willing to talk about it. So when did you arrive at this place? You're like, you know what? Screw it. I'm just going to tell you the story.
Yeah. So that would October of last year, I met Amy who is your wife, right? At a conference. And we had dinner with a random group of people. No one knew each other. And I started talking about the fact that I was in a partial hospitalization program or a PHP early last year. And I wanted to do something with that experience and really just all of my past experiences throughout my life in an honest and vulnerable way, because I don't think mental health is talked about enough. Certainly not in a vulnerable, you know, mind, I guess, just in a vulnerable state. And so I think, um, as I was talking with her, I was like, I want to do a podcast, but I really don't know where to start. And she's like, I know a guy. And um, so then I met you, and I remember our very first conversation really well. You asked me some tough questions actually about just why I wanted to do this and if I was going to be able to continue the content and really to probably understand my why behind it. And hopefully you were able to see the passion behind the topic that I had. I'm sure you did, but
I did.
um,
Mhm.
so yeah, last October met Amy, was introduced to you, and then we launched in January.
So go check it out. Go subscribe, Honestly Mental, especially if you, let's say you're an employer, or let's say you're an HR, or let's say so you have a friend that has a mental health challenge. Erica's going to not just tell you about her experience, but she brings other people on to share their experiences, in particular how it relates to work, right? And how it relates to relationships. Because I think this is one of those big misnomers. Because I've been diagnosed with depression twice. And I want you to talk about PHP, but I don't want to do that in just a second because
Okay.
I think that there are so many people when you hear of a depression diagnosis, they don't really know what to say to you, don't really know what to do
Yep.
because it's a subject we don't really learn much about. We've basically ignored it for most of human history until very recently. So this was me, my first time I was diagnosed. I think I was 19. So I was in college, didn't know what to do. And they gave me some pills, and the pills didn't help. And that's a whole different story for another day.
Yep.
But that talking to people about it, going through this process and seeing a therapist, I had to keep it very close because people judged you.
Oh, certainly. Yeah. And especially not to age you too much, Rob, because I don't think you're up there, but
I've been
just
there.
20 years ago, even, which really in the grand scheme of things isn't that long ago, the language wasn't there to talk about.
Mhm.
And the judgment that came with it, especially as a male, I can't imagine what it was like in your shoes back then.
Yeah, and it's funny, I don't think I paid too close attention to it, but I did keep it close here.
Yeah.
And oddly enough, it's always the person, and maybe this is something you can share too, Erica, the person that opened your eyes that there's help out there. And it was my college girlfriends, actually the woman I dated before Amy. Her mother was a nurse and suggested it in a nice, gentle way over and over again that it's not crazy, it's not weird. Actually, people see results.
Yeah.
And as she talked about it, that was really that encouragement to first for me seek the college counselor out, who was like a graduate student. But from there, it went to psychologist and then a psychiatrist where I got my prescriptions. So there was a little entryway in there because I had never heard about such a thing at 18,
Yeah.
19 years old. Was it the same for you?
I think as we'll say chaotic as my upbringing was, the one thing that I did benefit from was the fact that um, my mother has her own mental health challenges. And so it wasn't unheard of in our house to go to therapy,
Hmm.
have counseling, meet with a psychiatrist. There were times like just when my parents separated and being a child of a separation, they proactively kind of put us in different means of counseling. And
Mhm.
so I had always just been used to it, thankfully. So my experience was much different than yours was, but that's really where it came from. And then, as I became an adult, it was really just leaning, into diagnoses that I've had, which of course, depression, anxiety, PTSD.
You're trying to get them all. Like, give me all these things.
Yes. Trying to just, get as many diagnoses as possible, right? So I had known since I was a teenager, a young teenager, like 15 years old, 14, 15, that I was struggling with mental health
Mm.
challenges. And so it was communicating that. But like I said, because it wasn't foreign in our household, it was easy to get treatment. Now, easy to get treatment and then get treatment that actually works are two different things because I don't think I got the appropriate level of care that I needed when I was younger and really starting to, battle depression and anxiety.
I was at an event, and this was an event about misinformation and disinformation, of which I think there's a ton on mental health in both categories. And they defined misinformation as when you mistakenly get something wrong and you share it. Disinformation is when you put the false out knowing it's false. So,
Yeah.
and I don't bring that up to necessarily say anything other than this, Erica. There was a guy there named Kenny from Mississippi, and he talked about the limited resources that particular town where his relatives still live in terms of healthcare, right? Breast cancer research and equipment to detect breast cancer. And I think that that's a big portion of this too is access to mental health isn't always equal depending on where you're at. If you live in a city, if you live in a city that has maybe colleges that produce psychologists and therapists or whatever versus not. So was that one of the challenges in growing up and as you described a chaotic childhood?
I think as I was younger, I didn't yet have a voice for myself
Mm,
to advocate for what it was I needed. And I don't think I really knew how to name it either. The language wasn't there as a young teenager. Um, in fact, because I've always been relatively open, I did get put on medication. It was Zoloft at the time.
that was my first too. Zoloft.
Yes, right?
Woo!
And it's like a go-to, I think, when you start going down the medication path. But
Mhm.
I remember playing soccer in high school, and I was open and honest about taking medication for depression, and then I would get made fun of. So it was like if I was having a bad day, which everybody has a bad day, you don't need a mental health diagnosis to have a bad day. If I had an off day, it would be, "Oh, did you take your happy pill?" type of comments, which really didn't help
No.
anything,
Mm-mm.
right? And so I wanted to back out of therapy, back out of psychiatric care at that time because of the stigma associated with it, and really what it was doing to the people that I, thought would understand at least a little bit.
Mhm.
I don't fault anybody for that though, because as I mentioned earlier, 20 years ago, we didn't have the same language that we do today, and it's still not where it needs to be. Um, when I was in El Paso, access was a big problem because of the sheer volume of really the therapists per capita within that demographic, I think was a challenge.
Mhm.
So that became difficult to get in timely because you know how it goes. You find a therapist. It could be a month or two before getting in, and then you establish a regular cadence. And psychiatry could take even longer to get into that. So I think access 100% is a big problem, but also a reason why people, may or may not have the care they need.
And it's very easy to fall out of care if it's that difficult to get. So I lived in a town called Hanson, Massachusetts, and I had to find a psychiatrist who prescribed me my Zoloft. Wellbutrin was second, and that's when I just quit. I was like, forget it. I'm not.
That was my second one too, and I quit after it because it didn't work. And I was like, this is just,
It
I
was
don't know what
worse.
this is, but it was not good. The side
No.
effects of Wellbutrin were horrible.
Yeah, I always just felt like I was in a fog all the time because what they had me
Yes.
do is, right, they had Zoloft up to a certain milligram, and they said, okay, we're going to dial down this, and we're going to introduce Wellbutrin. And I was just like, this is horrible.
Yes.
But I mean, I had to find a provider in network that was covered by insurance, and I had to drive an hour and 15 minutes each way for a 15-minute appointment. And this was growing up in suburban Boston. You think that with all the education, now granted, this is, the late 90s. Even then, the access was still spread out. And then my first therapist, Erika, he left, he quit, he moved. So I had just established this relationship. This is the first person I'm actually sharing some real intimate things about myself with. And he's
Right.
like, hey, by the way, thanks for that 50-minute appointment. And that's the last one because I'm moving to another part of the state. And I was like, oh, okay. But don't worry, we got someone you can start over with already in
Oh,
place,
that's
right?
awful.
They're barriers to our own mental health.
Yep, absolutely. I have a similar story, Rob. So it's so funny. We're like on the same wavelength as it relates to mental health. But like in high school, after I had, gone through a traumatic experience, well, actually in high school, but later on after I had stopped the Zoloft or whatever, this was when they tried Wellbutrin. I had a therapist quit, and it was cited that my case was too near and dear to her heart and she couldn't do it anymore. So like I felt 100% responsible. I also felt like I must be pretty messed up to
Why would you
have my
not think that?
therapist quit, you know?
Yeah.
So wild, just absolutely insane back then.
Do you
I'm
do it
I'm
differently now, Erika? So, I mean, again, going back to then versus now, you mentioned PHP, which is a partial hospitalization program. So, before you explain that, are you more confident in the system you're in now to give you help that you need?
I think my confidence is higher, but I still think there's a lot that needs to be fixed as it relates systemically. There are challenges with insurance and access. It's all some of those same things. Um, I think what hasn't changed is the fear and anxiety of needing to find somebody and then almost do a test drive with them to see if they're going to work out. And I think that's probably why some people give up so quickly because it takes trial and error with therapists and psychiatry to be able to find somebody that you mesh with. And I don't know how to fix that.
Right.
But I think that's still, a thing. And it's daunting. I remember, we moved up here to Michigan, and obviously last year I started my care with my primary care physician, and he was phenomenal with like the medication and understanding mental health issues, but that's not his general practice. And that's where he referred me to the PHP. I'll get into that a little bit more later, but um, you know, from there at the same time, I had to find a therapist and just what do you do? Google therapists in the area and
Right.
look at pictures and specialties and hope that you're gonna click. Um, it's hard. It's
Mhm.
hard. There should be like a matchmaking service,
That's a good idea. That actually may be how do you solve the problem, Erika. That
There
could be
you go.
your next entrepreneurial adventure there, right? It's
Yes.
I want this, 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 and this. My demeanor is this, 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 and this. Oh, look, a therapist is matched to me because you can skip that process, right? Because it is expensive. I mean,
Mhm.
if you have insurance, I don't know how many insurance plans cover mental health care. The last one that I was on, it didn't have any. And then when the COVID hit, they had an online platform that you could get, I don't know, a session or 6, I can't remember, for
Mhm.
that was part of the program, which I thought, "Okay, that's progress," but there's also something about being in person with your therapist to create that connection that I think is really necessary. Now, PHP, because this I wanna talk about since we're here, because this is yeah, I think I had my worst when I was, like, 19. I had this, like, real down part, and it was, I was not my best, let me put it that way. I never even I don't even know if there was a such thing as a partial hospitalization program, and had there been, I'm very doubtful that he would have done it because of what you said about that stigma. Because, okay, it's
Mhm.
one thing to go to therapy, it's another thing to go to the hospital to get your mental health care in what's actually called a partial hospitalization program. Like, to
Yep.
me, that seems, "Oh, no, I'm not that bad." So
Yep.
how did you decide, "Yes, this is the path that I need to take?"
Yeah, I think even in today's day and age, people don't know about the a partial hospitalization program and what it's intended to do. So, in my experience last year, I had never heard of it myself.
Mm.
And when my primary care physician, we had gone through a few rounds and months of trying to adjust medication, find something that worked. I did have better luck than Zoloft and Wellbutrin. Yes. And, I've since had even additional medication changes and whatnot. A whole nother topic we can touch on. But he I started so I had to have surgery in January. It was an outpatient surgery. It wasn't a big serious thing. But I did have to go under general anesthesia, and I knew I needed more help when my husband asked me if I was nervous about that surgery. And my response was no, not at all. And in reality, it wasn't just no, it was no, but I would be totally fine if the worst happened.
Mm.
And that's when I started recognizing the signs of the suicidal thoughts and suicidal ideation that I had had. I told my doctor and he was like, "I think that I know you're working on finding a therapist, but I think you need something that is a bit more than conventional talk therapy. In this moment of crisis, you are having a mental health crisis." That was a lot to swallow, because as open and honest, as I am about mental health, I think because of the stigmas that are out there, I also heard the term hospitalization. I heard the term mental health crisis, and the picture I had painted in my head was not I wasn't that bad, just like you said, right? Or now that it was being recommended, maybe I was that bad. And the fact of the matter is it's not good or bad. It's your current circumstances, and partial hospitalization programs are crisis management. So when somebody is struggling with thoughts of wanting to unalive themselves or, self-harm, that's a mental health crisis. And a partial hospitalization program can support that level of care. So it's a higher level of care than conventional therapy, and then above that would be like an inpatient program.
Were you there
Um,
all the time?
yes,
Mhm.
right. And with the partial program, you are stable enough, even though you're having suicidal thoughts, you're stable enough to go home and be safe, not to harm yourself or others every day. So it's almost like a 9 to 5 job. I think the first program I did was like 8:30 to 3. I just completed another hospital stay within the partial hospitalization program, and that was from 9 to 2:30. So, but I got to go home every day. And so that's kind of the different levels of care that you have, right? And that's where the partial hospitalization fits almost in the middle of your conventional, and then more often people have heard of inpatient psychiatric care.
I'll compare it to coaching. And, you and I are both coaches in a way. We both
Yeah.
have different skills. So you can hire a coach, a therapist, and you can go once a week and you're going to learn. You're going to pick up tools once a week. Then that next level is let's do more of it. Let's immerse ourselves in it where it's 6 hours a day and you
Yep.
learn the tools and you get some other opportunities to share and understand that you're not alone because other people are sharing too. So you're just immersing yourself in it partially. And then there's the third step of just saying, okay, we're just going to knock this all out in 3 days. We're coming in. We're going to go 3 days. Not that this applies necessarily to severe mental health issues, but in the rally model, right? You show up
Yeah.
for your 3 days, you learn your tools, and you go off in the world. Because even if you never look at your notes again, you take things with you. So do you
Right.
find that that applies? So the therapy approach would have been a slower approach for you. So being in the PHP, did it speed up your healing process?
I think it sped up getting out of crisis.
Okay.
I think again, just reiterating that partial hospitalization programs, there's also another level of care that just I was reminded of as you were talking called intensive outpatient programs. So you notice the word hospitalization is dropped from it. Um, that kind of sits in between therapy and the partial hospitalization program. So it's intensive because it's like 2 to 3 times a week instead of every day of the week until you're discharged out of a partial hospitalization program. But I think it helps with crisis. The programs are not, while you have a care team with therapists and psychiatrists, there isn't a huge amount of time for processing. Now, I had two different experiences with what that looked like in terms of processing what you're going through. But the basis of both an IOP, intensive outpatient program, or a PHP would be to get you out of crisis.
Mm.
And with things like, and you learn tools like distraction or opposite action is a big one. So, like for me, I often want to just go to sleep. Um, I'm safe in my own bed under my
Yes.
weighted blanket. Nothing's going to happen. Life can't happen to me while I, am sleeping. And so that's my go-to. And opposite action would be go for a walk, find
Mhm.
something else to do. So there's a lot of different tools that are taught, and they will actually tell you they are not intended for everyday use as it relates to your mental health, because you don't, hopefully you're not in those cycles for a significant period of time. It's to get you out of the crisis scenario so you can get to a place where you can process in therapy, and follow like an aftercare plan.
But you also, Erica, have an interesting side part of this story, and I love that explanation. I think it is absolutely fantastic. So, depending on where you're at, right? Just like we have crisis medicine, same thing, right? There's more
Yeah.
doctors, nurses available to get you through the crisis. You kind of channeled all of your energy while you're struggling with mental health as a teenager into work. And,
Yeah.
and this became part of the story. And you talk about this so well on Honestly Mental, your podcast, that, this is Erica's story, right? It's that to use your focus. So you said, okay, I've got this mental health challenge. I need something to focus on. It's almost like you do it by instinct, right? Survival instinct kicks in and you find this channel. And I wonder now, in thinking out loud, if I did the same thing with my radio career, because I could just do that and I could focus on it and I could get lost in it and I wasn't thinking those negative thoughts. Was it the same for you?
Yeah, it really was until the day it wasn't. Right? And I say that because it's so true. For years, 20 years, I did the same thing as it related to work and wrapped my identity into what I did as professional. And I didn't know I was doing that at the time, but
Mm.
all of my energy, all of my focus was put into work. Even after I got married and then had my first son, it was always work, 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 work. Work was the priority, and sadly, not my family. That's because I didn't really, uh, work was my safe place too. So I
Life
mentioned
saving.
the chaotic
Mhm.
childhood, and I was able to go to work and get out of unhealthy circumstances. And so it was even more my identity was even more enmeshed in work than I had ever known, until last year when I experienced my mental health crisis, because things at work um, were just going differently than I had been used to. I didn't feel seen and heard at
Mm.
all. And because work was my world, it felt extremely monumental, and my world, in essence, was crumbling around me. And so, yeah, that was my identity. And that it was easy to put all of my energy and focus into work as a distraction in some ways, I think, from traumatic events that I had been through and hadn't processed. And boy, did they all come crashing down at the same time.
Well, you did it in the right place, right? You just get it all out as best you can and say,
Yes.
here we go. If we're going to deal with this, let's just deal with it all.
Yes.
So, when did you start to form a work identity? Because this actually is an interesting story in which you tell a speech about it. If you go back to the age of 14 at your ice cream shop.
Yeah. You know, do you want me to share the dead squirrel story? Because
I
I
would
can give the
love to hear the
abbreviated
dead squirrel
version.
because I think this
Um,
actually is so indicative, right? Of number one, who you are. You're a go-getter. You have tons of accolades as a woman in leadership in the staffing industry. You're very highly regarded by the staffing industry people that know you. So you've done all, like you said, you've done all these right things. You got some big award, like 40 under 40 or something like
yeah,
that. And it was like a big
40 under
deal for
40.
you. Yeah.
Huge.
So
Um,
let's trace this back to the dead squirrel.
the dead squirrel. It holds a very dear place in my heart. No. So yeah, I was 14 years old when I entered the workplace, and my first job was at Roaring 20s Ice Cream Parlor. I was an ice cream scooper, waffle cone maker, probably
Nice.
one of the best jobs in the world. You already know this, but I got to get free ice cream every shift. And seriously, that is, I don't know,
Yeah.
not many jobs can beat that,
No,
right?
best work
Like,
ever. Do you have a
yes.
favorite type of ice cream that you would go back to and get over and over again at Roaring 20s? Or did
No,
you
because
variety it out?
I would try all of the different ice cream. Now, I love a good like cherry ice cream, whether it's black cherry, amaretto cherry, all of that. But the reason it was different back then is they had just come out with like the soft serve flavor burst. And
Oh.
so you could get like 25 different flavors in the cup. Like, yeah. So anyway, I would try all sorts of things.
Good for you.
Um, but anyway, one day I went to work and got there, and as we were approaching the building at the, age of 14, I noticed a squirrel that was no longer alive in front of the door. And obviously, people are not going to come get ice cream if there's a dead squirrel laying in front of the door. So, as you mentioned, I was just eager beaver and was like, what can I do to resolve this? So I volunteered and had to walk across the street to the lumber company to borrow a shovel. Um, the abbreviated, part of it is I went back, took care of the squirrel. My coworkers shared with the owner and my boss that I was unprofessional for some reason. And when I asked to borrow the shovel. And so I had to go apologize.
Hmm.
And I did that on my own accord. I was somebody who held myself accountable. So I was like, well, I don't think I did this, but if I did, then I want to own up to it. So I'll go apologize. Walked across the street, apologized, and the gentleman was just like, I have really no clue what you're talking about. He was like, I appreciate the sentiment, but you weren't rude or disrespectful at all. That was the best outcome that I could have hoped for in that situation, because my boss heard it, firsthand, that I wasn't unprofessional. And two things kind of came out of that, right? One, I had to learn how to deal with other coworkers for whatever reason trying to tamper out my success, I guess.
Sure.
Like,
Mhm.
and so I'll never understand why, but it was also me taking ownership of something that wasn't mine to own. And I did that without even thinking about it. That's just what I was used to doing. Okay, I guess I'll just own this and apologize and move on and whatever. And there's a time and place to actually do that when it's yours to own, as opposed to the situation that was created by my coworkers and essentially lying about
Yeah.
an
Big
interaction.
Mhm.
And so that was tough as a 14-year-old, if you can only imagine, hormones going crazy, and then add in that, didn't really know what to think. But that was my entry into the workforce, is taking ownership over things that weren't mine to own, and also having to deal with challenging coworkers.
At a time when your brain is developing, as you mentioned, right? Not just
Yes.
the hormones of the puberty changes, but the changes that your mind goes through.
Yeah.
And you start to interpret experiences a little bit differently than you did as a child. And that sets up course the path that you go forth. So
Yeah.
then talk about this type of thing in a PHP program, at least in your now two PHP programs, because I've found so much value in processing my own feelings and my own thoughts and really tracing them back to when I was 14 so that if I do, Erica, I can maybe look at it a different way now because my view of the world, if shaped at 7 or 8, well, let's be honest, we're 7 or 8. We're
Yep.
still developing. And if you're interpreting the world still from something that happened when you were 7, you don't have to interpret the world that way anymore. No, it's not like it's easy.
Right.
Feels weird. You got to go inside here. Like my case, I like to write, so I write out my processing. But you sometimes arrive at a place and it helps you go, oh, it just feels like it gave me so much relief to be able to
Mhm.
diagnose where that weird feeling came from.
Yeah. And the clarity that comes from it. So, you know, I really didn't have what I would call like an epiphany until I was in the partial hospitalization program. And I, we were talking about affirmations, and I don't have an issue challenging things from time to time. I think most people who know me know that about
I mean,
who
if
I
you're
am.
going to pick up a dead squirrel at 14, you're going to take care of business.
I'm going to take care of business. Absolutely. So I I have affirmations all over. Actually, I made this. It's got some cool stickers and stuff in it. Just I can do hard things, always be kind, keep growing, keep going. Um, I have tattoos that are affirmations. And as much as I would like to believe they work for me, they don't. And so we were talking about affirmations, and I just remember, kind of a little bit snarky, was like, all right, so let me get this straight. What you're telling me is, if I repeat these affirmations, say in the mirror every single day, one day it's just going to click and boom, I'm going to be healed. Like, because
Oh,
work was
simple.
always my safe place. And that's, I'm not going to work right now. So I don't really understand how this is going to help. And the clinician was like, well, see, Erica, the moment work became your safe place, it was no longer work.
Hmm.
Right. So just because it was so important to me, I'll repeat it. The moment work becomes your safe place, it is no longer work. And what I took that as is not to bifurcate my personalities, if you will, but like really
Great word, by
truly.
the way. Good
Yeah.
word.
Right. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Um, I Work is part of, if you will, my identity, but it is not all consuming my identity. Like, I am so much more than what I do professionally. And it wasn't until that moment that I realized how I ended up where I was mentally, from a mental health perspective, and where the crisis came into play, going all the way back to those types of stories, like the dead squirrel situation when I first entered the workforce. So
Hmm.
I said past tense, but actually it's present tense still. I have to still process and unlearn 20 years of behaviors that I taught myself. And so that's going to take time. And I'm still very much in that process.
And I think that it's just so relevant to me because I'm a newish entrepreneur, less than a year. Certain things I did at the very beginning of the entrepreneurial journey didn't work out as well as I had hoped, or some of them are taking way longer than I thought I would hoped. And I'm creating new programs as a communication coach. And it's this idea of selling. I've got so much fear around it. And as I'm in this transition period, Erica, I've noticed that some of these things are popping back into my head that haven't popped into my head for a long time. I'm like, wow, okay. So it's still in there. The good news is I have tools now, know how to manage it because they're there. They're going to be there from time to time.
Yep.
It's just, I know how to not listen to them and how to not let it become too bad. But
Yep.
that was work that I've had to do over the last 6 or 7 years consistently,
Yeah.
daily, to be able to flex this muscle the right way. Is that because you're doing the same thing, right? You're now entrepreneurial journey. You also
Yeah.
had another life shell bomb dropped on you recently. You're dealing with transitioning out of corporate into your own. And then, hey, you know what? Erica, we know you've tested your mental health skills and your tools, but let's throw another crazy thing at you and see how you deal with this. So, I bring this up in those big transitions, and you can divulge this big life personal change if you want.
Yeah.
You have to deal with these again, but you now have a year's worth of tools to be able to apply. So, how are you applying these tools, and how is it helping or not your journey with these new changes?
Yeah. So I'm gonna go ahead and share because I think it's part of my story. And it's interesting to me that I went from one identity crisis to another identity crisis.
Well, you did it once. Let's do it again.
So what in a totally different capacity though. This one I think cuts a lot deeper. I talked about my childhood just a little bit without, getting into details. And my upbringing was less than ideal. Um, and I had a father figure, and he's my dad. And I had learned of some medical things that may be going on in my family on my maternal side, and I wanted to test myself to see if I was at risk so I could do what I could. It was for early onset Alzheimer's,
Mm.
so that I could take precautions as soon as possible, like for the longevity of my life. And as part of that, I got my genealogy results and learned that I am 26% Asian, the
Mm.
majority of which is Japanese. And I know that my father's side of the family does not have any type of Japanese in there. So
Huh.
basically, my bio dad is not who I grew up with as my father. And that was, I mean, it's been earth-shattering for me. I May was like a really good month. I left corporate America in April. I really started finding and figuring out who I was as a wife and a mom because, I knew who I was work-wise, but I also
Sure.
had to start prioritizing my life a little bit differently and untethering my identity from work. And so I started doing that, and I mean, that was over a year since I had been in the PHP the first time. May was a phenomenal month. May, I launched my company, Strategenius, which is a consulting business within the staffing industry, and I was on cloud 9 to some degree. It was challenging, but I felt amazing. I felt like myself more than I have in the past 5, 8 years,
Wow.
and it was I mean, it was great. My husband was like, "You're present, you're here, we can feel it." I felt it, and then I got the news basically that my dad was not my dad.
No big
Um,
deal. Sorry you
no
had
big
a great month. How about June?
Yeah. So June, I tried to kind of remember some of the tools that I had learned, as you mentioned, from the first PHP. But the crazy thing that happens when you're in crisis, all that goes out the window and you kind of forget
Absolutely.
some of those tools because it's crisis management. So there were things that I learned, to apply on a daily basis. Consistency, you mentioned, is key. It's critical. But the crisis intervention tools, if you will, you're not using them regularly, hopefully. And I had a resource, like a binder of all of the tools and stuff, but I didn't pull it out. There were some things I would probably do a little differently, but I don't think I realized I was in it as much as I was until it was almost a little too late to not do a partial hospitalization program again. But my symptoms were a lot different. So I think I went on a little bit for a few weeks without realizing
Oh,
how
interesting.
severe it was getting, right? Because my mental health challenges have always manifested themselves in pretty much the same way, whether
Mm.
it's suicidal ideation or things like that, right? And this time I was dealing with urges to self harm. I was dealing with an extremely high level of anxiety, but it wasn't turning into panic attacks like it had in the past. And it was wild. I've been clenching my jaw because I'm still very much in it. I just completed my program on Tuesday. So my like body is so anxious. The way it's trying to get out some of the energy is to clench my jaw. And it hurts to eat a
Mhm.
burger or, opening my mouth and different things or sleeping on this side of my face. So it's rough, but the program the second time around was really good in dusting off the tools that I had already learned. So I'm still, I would say, maybe not in as much crisis, but I think there is still a crisis going on. I think until I process things a bit further,
Mhm.
um, I'm dealing with a lot of unknowns and a lot of uncertainty. And in general, I've never been good with that anyway. I know the majority of people are not. You don't operate well in uncertainty. And so I may never get answers. And there are some things that I'm having to grapple with that are really difficult. So, back to therapy once a week.
Yes.
And if I have to do another PHP, the option is always there.
And I think that's the way that what you just described, Erica, is an effective approach to mental health because we're all different. Your story's different than mine. Your journey's different than mine. Although there are some similarities, right? Because there's still many things lacking in mental health care. But the important part is to find ways to stay persistent and consistent. And so you have tools, use them. In whether that tool be PHP, because that's a tool. Like all right, I'm at this point because it manifested different than it did last year. So why would I not go back and use this tool that was so effective? Because I
Yeah.
think that's the purpose of all of the work is understanding how your mind works and your body works, because it's not always what you think. And it's when you can use those tools and jump back in and be persistent and consistent that you can face the challenges that may pop up.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. I think I'm thankful and I'm so grateful for all the tools that I've had and knowing that the partial hospitalization program is an option, and that it continues to be an option. Now, I don't want to continue having mental health crises, but
Right.
now that I've got a second one in a year under my belt, then, maybe I'll get a little bit longer of a stretch here.
Well, you
I'm
should
not
get like a WWF belt or something,
I
like
know.
the
Yes.
champion. I've done this
Yeah.
twice.
Done it twice.
Okay.
But I am thankful for the resources that I've had, and that I've learned over the course of these two programs. It's been really phenomenal in that sense. It's been it's parts of it have actually been fun, like, and that probably sounds a little counterintuitive to a mental health crisis, but as part of that, I get to figure out my identity. I get to figure out what I like, what I don't like. And that kind of experimental part has been a lot of fun. Frustrating at times.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
I keep trying to read, and I'll find a good book and I can read, and then I just fall off the wagon.
Mm-hmm.
But and then I'm like, oh, here I go, I failed again. Um, which
Beat
is
yourself up. Mm-hmm.
yep, a lovely thing that oftentimes people with mental health challenges, especially depression, typically do. That negative self-talk that you mentioned earlier.
Mm-hmm. I'm good
Um,
at that. I'm an expert at that.
me too. Let me tell you. That's why one of the stickers says always be kind, because I need to be kinder to myself, which is huge.
Yes.
I will say that's been a big revelation out of last year's partial hospitalization program, and then the ongoing aftercare in therapy that I've been working on is um, a lot of who I am today stems from what I would say is I had example after example of being unlovable, unprotected, those very difficult things. Like I don't know how to love myself because those
Mhm.
behaviors weren't modeled for me.
Sure.
um I can give all the love in the world to other people and care for other people, but to care for myself is really difficult. And so I don't know where I was going with that, but I wanted to say it because I think, it's where I'm at in my journey. That's where I was going
Yeah.
is, my focus right now is how to be more self-compassionate and how to love myself more so that I can really avoid um, going into a mental health crisis. Because at the end of the day, if I have more confidence in myself and who I am, I think that will help keep me clear of that, as it could anybody who is on a similar journey.
Is there, Erica, a tool that you have found to be your go tool or something that's really helpful most of the time?
I'm still figuring that out. I say that a lot on my podcast is still figuring it out.
Mm-hmm.
Still very much a work in progress. Um, for me, the self-love and self-compassion components, that may sound completely foreign to some people because there are an awful lot of confident, self-loving individuals out there. And to not love yourself may be and actually I would say in some ways to hate yourself could be a huge leap for people who don't have the same challenges to understand or even,
Mm-hmm.
contemplate. So I haven't found a silver bullet. I don't think there will be one. It is continuing to take each one of these scenarios and traumatic events and really sorting through what was a lie and what was not, and unpacking it in a way that I can recognize that it wasn't a reflection of me or my lovability, because we're all inherently born loved, worthy, and enough.
Mm-hmm.
So it's one of those things in the speech that I did, like, until life experiences happen, then that could be warped a little bit. And in my case, completely demolished. So I have to build it back up. And it's just going to take a lot of time.
Yeah.
That's why, figuring out what I like, what I don't like in terms of hobbies and things like that is a big part of this process. Um, Honoring my feelings a lot of the time and naming them has been huge. Um, I struggle with a lot of body image issues and things like that. And on the outside, people would hear me say that potentially and be like, "Really?" And the answer is yes, really. I struggle with a lot of self hatred in all ways you can think because of my past experiences. So I've got to sift through all of that to really get to the truth, for me to love myself
Yeah.
and know that I am lovable.
I'm glad you put it that way because it just makes a lot of sense. And the older I get, the more I understand this journey that we're on and how you have your perspective, and that's really all you have, right? It's how you live life and all the things that happen that you experience, and then what you do with it after you experience those things. So one of the things I remind myself, it's I don't know so much it's a tool, it's to your point about an affirmation, but it's just a reminder. Like if I get in a stressful situation and I feel, oh, this isn't going my way, the phrase life happens for you is what I tell myself, because then, okay, it reminds me to start looking at the opportunities here, opportunities to learn, whether it's a new skill, whether it's a new whatever, something about myself. And if I do that consistently enough, it can take me out of my head where I ruminate over and over again and helps me refocus on what happened.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. You said that on the first episode of my podcast that we did, because I had you interview me,
Mm-hmm.
which was a lot of fun. But you said life happens for you and not to you. And that is one of those kind of adages that is helpful in framing out the opportunity that can come from a difficult circumstance. And that's something that you mentioned, consistency. We've talked about that a little bit. I'm going to hit that one again. It's really important for those types of things to be done every single day, multiple times a day, so that that muscle is developed and toned properly and you can flex it as needed. So I think that's a really good tool to get out of your head a little bit and really look for those opportunities to learn.
If someone is in a position right now that maybe you were in a year ago, Erica, and you knew you needed to do something, what would you advise someone to do? Take that first step.
Yeah. Um, I think a card that is underutilized is leveraging your primary care physician. I say that because the list of therapists and Googling and it being daunting, your primary care physician has enough education and knowledge around mental health to be able to help you in some ways and then also make recommendations beyond that. So a lot of times primary care physicians will have therapists that they work with or psychiatrists that they work with, and so instead of your list being hundreds and hundreds of people long, if you're in an area where there's that many
Mm-hmm.
options, it starts narrowing it down, which taking things in bite-sized chunks, especially in a mental health crisis, is important. So I would say go to your PCP. And I don't know that the average person would think about that resource first as a way to start the
Yeah.
journey of getting help. Um, versus jumping straight into therapy or psychiatry. Now, if you already have a therapist that you have a rapport with, that's a little bit different. I would suggest you work with them.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, they'll probably help you come to the conclusion that you need a higher level of care if necessary, right? Um, but where that doesn't exist, go to your PCP. Start there.
I like that. It's a good kind of entry level, relatively easy thing to do because, we usually see our doctors once a year, anyways. So if you
Yep.
got your appointment already on tap, and I think another resource too is, if Erica talks about it on Honestly Mental, she'll talk about it not on Honestly Mental. So if you know of a friend that has gone through a process, reach out to that friend and say, I need something. What do you recommend? And at least start a dialogue there, because the big part that I think needs to change, and you mentioned, Erica, some of the other things like access, insurance, whether there's enough available, but the stigma that still remains, because it is difficult to talk about. But I don't find that it is that difficult to talk about because it's so relatable to so many people. It's
Mhm.
just the people like us that have gone through it have to be a little bit more willing to share the stories, because I do find that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. I do find that the tools that I have completely changed my life and completely put me in control of my identity, not my little 7-year-old self that defined me. And I know
Yep.
that sounds a little frou-frou and a little bit weird, but Erica's main point here is that your identity drives your behaviors. And your identity often is controlled by your subconscious. And your identity is essentially what you think of yourself, truly what you feel about yourself, what you've experienced, and how you've interpreted those experiences. And you can change those, alter those. You can go in your brain or your feelings and do the work
Yeah.
if you're willing to do it, right? And I think that to me, Erica, is really this overhanging challenge that is going to take us as individuals to share our stories, of which you are doing to, I think, an awesome degree, because you're a pretty badass person and you
Thank
still go
you.
through this, right? But you can be both things. You can still be a badass, awesome, amazing mom, amazing wife. By the way, the episode on Honestly Mental with Sergio, your husband, is phenomenal because he is
Yeah.
funny,
It's
and he
fun.
says he's funny in the podcast, but he actually is funny. So I would definitely encourage you to check that one out because they talk about too the mental health challenges of being a married couple. That is important, right? And do you find now that you are doing this and talking about this that it's the same, that people are coming to you and saying, "Erica, thank God I'm not alone."
Yeah, 100%. And the other advantage of talking about your stories, um, you hit on this a little bit, but what works for you may not work for me. So the more we are talking about our what does work for us individually at any given point in time, and there's more people talking about it, there are potentially more tools, an endless amount of tools available that you can trial and error to figure out what works best for you. But that only happens if we're talking about them.
Exactly. And I think for me, what I've understood, Erica, I'm in control of me, and that's it. I can't control what Amy says, my wife. I can't control what you say or what you think. I can only present myself. So that means if I am in charge, I am ultimately in charge of my identity and what I want it to be. And if I decide that my identity is something and I'm not that yet, what do I need to learn to be that? And
Yeah.
then go jump into a program, learn some skills, do whatever it takes. It's almost weird when you zoom out, when you have tools, how you look at things differently than when you're just in it all the time and you're not
Yes.
thinking about it from a different perspective. And I think that for me, for almost 40 years, that was my big challenge is I was so in it. I didn't know how to zoom out and see patterns. And once I learned that, I could take these steps into, even when struggling, knowing I got my own back.
Yeah, that's so important. I think one of the other big lessons that come out of a partial hospitalization program are dialectics in your life. And a dialectic is something that would seemingly be opposite but both hold true at the same time. So I could say something like, I have a very difficult relationship and I love my mother, right? If I'm talking about her, say, for example. So w- I know even in the workplace, you talk about these scenarios where it's like when somebody is like, but, I'm successful, but, and really it can be and.
Mm.
Um, Even when you think that things are the opposite. And I think from a processing perspective, um, looking at a dialectic in your life, especially when they're almost butting heads or, going against each other, it can be both. And it has brought me a lot of clarity and peace because I'm not arguing with myself as much. And
Right.
that's one of the big things that I took away from this last program. They taught dialectic. So, dialectic behavioral therapy, DBT, is the basis for a lot of partial hospitalization programs. The one that I did most recently broke dialectics down a whole lot better than what I did just now, but know that two opposing forces
You
can
did
be
fine.
true at the same
Yeah.
time,
Yeah.
and it can help bring you peace and clarity too when you're trying to figure out who you are, or you're in crisis, or you're going through something traumatic.
So going back to the dead squirrel, 14 years old,
Yep.
it seemed, you mentioned this. It was almost your subconscious that drove you to do that, like instinct. I think that's an important factor too, is we all make decisions on instinct that we don't think about. It's taking some time to wonder why that really uncovers some things about what you believe about yourself. So, was that part of the PHP the first time around? Was going back through some of these things, Erica, and wondering how you got so your identity got wrapped up into work? Because when you lay it out logically, it makes sense, especially given that our bodies are programmed to survive, even mentally. So, if you're facing a tough mental situation here, let's go over here and find something we're good at and stick to that.
Yeah, it's the safe thing to do, really.
Mhm. Yes, exactly right.
But yeah, y to some degree, yes. I think the partial hospitalization program helped start peeling back the layers of the onion, if you will. It was the work that then came after in therapy where we really dove into how I got to where I was and did kind of like a chain of events of, the past and the traumas and how it played into where I ended up from an identity perspective that gave me the clarity. I would say PHP helped start it,
Mm.
and then PHP helped start it. I still had a big epiphany that, I considered work my safe place, and really those should be separate because that's the basis for which my identity ended up being enmeshed in work. But, it was the subsequent care after and the processing I am still doing today. Unfortunately, I've had a lot of trauma, more trauma than I feel like anybody should ever have to go through in a lifetime. No one should experience. But listen, I've I've been through PHP more than once, and that's probably because I've had more than one traumatic
In which you
experience in
explain
my
a
life.
lot of this in Honestly Mental too,
Yes.
about the difficulties of you growing up.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
I mean, it's interesting. I'll say this one thing that has just kind of hit me a little bit. Um, I've had all these traumas, and yet I'm still viewed as successful, confident, all of these things that I'm working on believing about myself today. If people realized what I came from, they were like, oh my God, like it's amazing that you've come as far as you have. So while things can feel lonely, overcoming challenges, traumatic experiences, and all of that, you aren't alone in conquering them. It can get exhausting to be strong and courageous or resilient. I find that when I'm struggling a lot, I don't want to be resilient. I just want to have a normal life, whatever that looks like. I really don't know what that looks like. I probably would be bored. That's what I'm going to go with. I would be bored if my life was quote unquote normal.
You definitely
Um,
would be bored. Mhm.
yeah, right. But anyway, I say that because they shape who you are. I've overcome a lot, and I need to be proud of what I've overcome, and I'm inching closer and closer to really being able to say that with confidence and believing it, um, more than I was a year ago.
Yeah.
So just
Mhm.
being able to say I'm closer is huge.
And I look at that as a success, and I like to advise clients that I work with to keep 2 lists because you need them both. Number 1, you need a success list because you've
Yes.
mentioned that one of your phrases is you can do hard things. That success list is to remind you that you can. So when you are facing something challenging, you look back at your roster and you say, "The back of my baseball card's got pretty good stats. So yes, I can do this hard thing." Now on the other side, I need this because I need to be reminded of the mistakes that I made so that I remain humble, so that I don't repeat those mistakes. Because sometimes the ego looks at the successes and be like, dude, you can do whatever you want.
Oh,
And then you do
yeah.
whatever you want. And you're like, that was stupid. So you got to have both these lists to work on. I
Yeah.
find that helps me.
No, I would agree. I think I talked a little bit about that in my speech, not necessarily in the same context, but it's really important to list out your successes, whether professionally for an array of different reasons or personally, because I love the analogy of the baseball card. You have your stats in the back, and it's like, hey, you've been here before,
Mhm.
And so I think it's a good reminder. I often think it's easier for us, not me personally, out there in general, it's easier for people to find the negative in things. So creating a list of the positives and accumulating those positives is extremely helpful for your mental health. When you don't even need to have a mental health crisis, right? You could just be
Exactly.
having a challenging day.
Mhm.
You don't have to have a diagnosis. If you pull out that baseball card of your stats, you can be your own cheerleader and be like, you've got
Exactly.
this.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, Erika, in closing, you're a podcast host, you're an entrepreneur, you're a mama, you are a wife, you are successful. Where do you find joy, and how does joy factor in to, I don't necessarily want to call it mental health recovery, but how does joy tie into your mental health plan?
Yeah, I have to find the joy. It takes a little bit more work on my end, at least in the
I
season
hear
that
you.
I'm in
Mhm.
today, right? But most of it comes from my boys and my husband. I shifting priorities with work from my first mental health crisis has put, right front and center how beautiful and amazing of a family I have. And then how just hugely supportive my husband is. And like you said, he's funny. So are my kids. Like I've got to get through the folks around me. And I've also been able to really be almost choosy about who is in my circle. And I think that has been a big part of my journey and healing and having my own set of cheerleaders behind the scenes, working for me when I'm down and out on myself. So um yeah.
I love that. And I think, Erika, this is one of many conversations I would love to have with you about this, because I definitely would love to dig in further about what's missing, because it's been a few years since I've been in and out of the mental health system, because I've gotten to a place where I kind of do it myself. So a lot has changed, including the
Yeah.
language that we use, right? You call it suicidal ideation. That's a newer term that I had not heard until we started to talk. And then unalive, which I heard recently on a TikTok video, that someone was talking about death but used that term unalive, and I heard you say unalive myself at one point. So the
Yeah.
language is updated, the systems have updated. So there's a lot that has changed between, my time and your current time. So I think
Yeah.
that's worthy of a conversation. Going back to what's also missing in going through it, and how is there better ways that maybe you and I can talk about to get interactive with teenagers? Because I don't know if you've seen these numbers, that 1 in 3 kids, teenagers, is dealing with depression on a severe level. And
Yep.
obviously, it's a lot to do with these phones, but that's a
Yep.
challenge too. So I'd love to get your thoughts on that. And if you want to do it briefly, and we can talk more about it later, because I'm sure it's so relatable to you.
Yeah, I mean, especially having 2 boys, one who's 11, um, I want to create a place where my kids feel comfortable coming to us about mental health. So all of the things that I have gone through, has been discussed with my boys. Well, Oliver just turned 4, so
Mhm.
there's not a whole lot that can be discussed there that he would understand. Um,
He's probably got
but
a fart joke for you, though.
yes, yes, he does. But my 11-year-old, on the other hand, it's important that the conversations are age appropriate, but that they're happening. So he knows that I have struggled with suicidal ideation in an age appropriate manner. And so
Mhm.
my goal, especially because I have boys and with the podcast and talking about things in an honest, fashion, hopefully people can apply them to their own teenagers and things like that, because yeah, the stats are climbing. They aren't getting better.
No.
Um and there's a few reasons I think for that systemically, as you've already, highlighted. But yeah, would be happy to talk about that with you again.
Okay. So for today, any final words of wisdom from Erika Diaz, Honestly Mental, the podcast, Strategenius, the company. What do you want to leave us with?
Just don't be afraid to ask for help. You don't have to be in crisis to ask for help. It could be simply asking for a cup of sugar, and I mean that in all sincerity. Don't be afraid to ask for help. You hopefully have surrounded yourself with people that you can rely on and point you in the right direction when you aren't able to make a decision or something on your own. Whatever it is that you're going through, ask for help.
Learn more about Erika. Her LinkedIn profile is linked in the show notes. So is the link to Honestly Mental, her podcast. Definitely check it out. Erika, thanks for being with us on Equal Matters today, where we're encouraging equal dialogue, because this is how you get to problem solving, digging in deep. Erika, we'll talk again soon.
Thanks, Rob.